Welcome to the Bucher and Friends podcast. Here is your host.
Let's send it over to Rick Bucher.
Rick Bucher.
Welcome to another episode of Bucher Friendless, subsidiary of Bucher and Friends and part of the United WeCast network. I'm Rick Bucher. You can see me on FS1, read me on Bleacher Report, and follow me on Twitter at Rick Bucher and on Instagram at Rick_Bucher. This is part 3 of my stories from the Warriors' old home. Let's see if I can speed up this stroll down memory lane that is up to now 3 podcasts and counting. And I know I could have done a Bill Simmons and just produced one big mega mess of a podcast on the subject. But the truth is that I've needed time to sift through everything. Just so we're clear, I covered the Warriors as a beat writer starting in 1992 when I took over for the late Ron Bergman, and did so until I left the Washington Post in 1998. Been covering the NBA ever since, and so lots happened. Lots gone on. I was gone exactly a year before ESPN hired me away from the Post, and I returned to the Bay Area. At that point, though, I was a full-blown national writer. My return to anything close to working the Warriors as a beat came in 2012 when I left ESPN and took a full-time local radio gig, essentially so I could be around to see my kids grow up. That's also when the Warriors, President Rick Welts to be specific, reached out to me about being the team sideline reporter. Now, with the TV studios about 3 blocks from the radio studios, and Mark Jackson, who I'd worked with at ESPN as fellow analysts on NBA Tonight, among other things, with him taking over as head coach, I thought it would be a perfect second gig to doing radio. I mentioned Welts and Jackson for a reason that I'll get into before we're done, if not in this podcast, in the next one. Now, covering the Warriors beat in the 90s meant, one, covering one of the biggest meltdowns of a franchise in league history. Maybe 2, but certainly 1. And it also entailed learning what it's like to cover a team with no home. Now, in the previous podcast, I promised to tell you about an exchange I had with Charles Barkley and something Webber whispered to Barkley when they met in the playoffs at the end of Webber's rookie year, which was his 1 year with the Warriors. I remember back to the playoff series, 94 playoff series, first round, best of 5. Webber went behind the back and dunked on Chuck. It was the one positive highlight the Warriors had, and the one time Charles didn't get the better of the Warriors in that series. In the one game at Oakland Coliseum Arena, this was Game 3 of the best of 5 series, Phoenix was already up 2-0, and Don Nelson had Byron Houston guard Charles one-on-one for the first 3 quarters. The plan being that Chuck would score at will, but he'd be the only one doing so. And then in the 4th quarter, the Warriors would double him, force the other Suns who had not been getting shots all game to do all the scoring. Chuck didn't make any secret of the fact that Byron couldn't guard him, was yelling literally at the bench, "You need to get somebody else who can guard me," and which was classic Chuck. In any event, Nelly's strategy didn't work. Barkley ended up with 56 points. But if you watch the highlights of that Webber dunk, afterward, he can be seen whispering something in Barkley's ear near the stanchion. And what he whispered was, "I want to be just like you." Which, now, looking back at their careers, equal parts entertaining and controversial, criticized for not doing everything they could have with their God-given talent, both stellar but falling short of winning rings, moving around more than players of their caliber ever should have in that era, and then even going on to have broadcasting careers for Turner, sometimes even sharing the same desk on TNT. I'd say Webber did a pretty damn remarkable job of doing exactly what he hoped to do. I also remember at the time, though, that Charles was not flattered or impressed. And I don't know where their relationship is now. I don't know if it's had to have thawed a little bit, but I never got the sense that Chuck was all that enamored with Webber wanting to be the next Charles Barkley. It was also after that game that Charles asked me to pass his number along to a young female intern who was working for the Warriors PR staff. She was, if I'm not mistaken, a University of Arizona undergrad with family in the Bay Area. That's why she was doing the internship there. In any event, she told me later that when Charles called her, she thought it was someone pulling a joke on her. So she asked him, "If you're really Charles, we made eye contact during the game twice. When was it?" Charles was able to tell her the first time was in the second quarter as he was headed to the bench for a timeout, and the second time he was standing at the free throw line about to take his second shot. If I'm not mistaken, she walked along the baseline. And he nailed it. Those were the two times. And I just never forgot that. I learned so much from that whole thing. First of all, no qualms about seeing somebody and figuring out I need to get a number for that. And the second part was in the midst of the game. I mean, we're talking a playoff game. He's dragging the Warriors, or maybe because he was dragging the Warriors, he also had the presence of mind to be scouting the sidelines. And for what it's worth, yes, to my knowledge, they did hook up. Don't know what happened. Don't care. But they connected, shall we say. Now, about that meltdown. It's funny when I think about how much I learned beyond basketball about the culture of the NBA through all that went down with the Warriors during that time. Including going out to Webber's house in an East Bay gated community, for instance. More than once I'd go out there. Webber would forget to leave my name at the gate, which meant I had to sit in my car just beyond the gatehouse and repeatedly call him to get him to call the gatehouse. And unfortunately, Webber was ahead of his time as someone who lets calls go to voicemail. I don't know that I ever left without actually seeing him, but there were times I'm sure I waited a couple of hours. It was a good thing that I was young and I was single and I was hungry. I don't know if in this day and age that I would have had the patience, or that at some point I wouldn't have read Webber the riot act for wasting my time. Any event, I guess I went out to his house 2-3 times, and in all that time, and he was only there a year, but he never had it fully furnished. It looked about like how I would have had it midway through my time at college, which is about the same timeline for his age. Now, for me, it was a great lesson in that physical size and a big bank account and loads of fame doesn't necessarily make anyone particularly mature. There's becoming a great basketball player, and then there's learning how to do the rest of life. And I think of all those $1 million mansions that I would drive by up these quiet streets and the perfectly manicured lawns. And here was a 20-year-old kid in sweatpants and a baggy T-shirt playing at being adult, playing video games, watching the living room TV that was over the fireplace from the counter in the kitchen because the bar stools were the only place to sit at the kitchen counter, eating takeout, and as it turned out, preparing to upend an NBA franchise. The one room that I remember that was particularly tricked out, it was his upstairs music recording studio, but that was about it. The neighborhood itself felt like a lot of old money in the possession of old people, and this was a kid with new money trying to figure out how to live on his own, a long way from home, all while battling a Hall of Fame coach and looking to raise what was essentially a fun little franchise into a snarling world beater. Good luck. Not that I put the onus, don't get me wrong, I don't put the onus for what happened on Webber. I put almost none of it on him, to be honest. Everybody's got a part. But The Warriors were the ones, after all, who drafted him. In a way, against his wishes, since he dreamed of A, being a power forward, and B, playing alongside Shaq in Orlando, who had the number 1 pick. All he was asking from Chris Cohan, the owner, was that he be able to come to him with any issues that he might be having with Nelson. And Cohan, in his infinite unfamiliarity with how the NBA works, sided with his coach and GM and refused. And I remember having a conversation with Dan Finan, who was the previous owner, and he said without equivocation that if he'd had to make the decision, Nelly would have been gone. That he understood the talent that Webber was, and in this day and age in the NBA, or then even then, you go with the talent. Coaches can be replaced. The Chris Webbers of the world for teams like Golden State could not. Now, for all of Nelly's misgivings about Webber, which I covered in the previous podcast, the team itself did not feel that way at all. They knew how talented he was and how much of a difference he could make in their fortunes. And because he was such a gifted passer, an unselfish passer, they loved him even more. So when Webber opted out of his contract and he didn't report to training camp, the players didn't actually believe the Warriors would go through and trade him. The belief was it was just a matter of when, not if he'd show up. And that carried them through the first 8 games of the season. Even without Webber, they went 7-1. And then the trade went down. Traded him to the Washington Bullets for Tom Gugliotta and 3 future first-round picks, essentially giving them a young replacement power forward and restoring the picks they'd given up to Orlando to get Webber in the first place. But shortly after Gugliotta showed up, and they saw him in the first couple practices, Nelson was overheard telling one of his assistants, "This trade is going to get us fired." As indeed it did at the All-Star break. After that 7-1 start, the team went 7-30. And Cohan cleared house. Longtime scout Ed Gregory took over as GM. Bob Lanier took over as head coach. And then Gregory wasted no time trading Gugliotta to Minnesota for Donyell Marshall. Now, the Warriors were playing the Sonics in the first game after the trade was announced. And I remember Sonics coach George Karl saw Montgomery in the hallway outside the locker rooms before the game. And Karl had this big grin on his face and said, "Man, that trigger finger didn't shake a bit." The backstory on that is when Nelson, serving only as GM, fired Karl with 18 games left in the 87-88 regular season, it was Gregory who did the mop-up duty as the head coach. And then Nelson took over as both head coach and GM the following year. Moral to the story, the NBA is indeed a small world. Now, Lanier is one of the nicest human beings ever. And he wanted to be an NBA head coach in the worst way. And the fact that he wound up as the Warriors head coach was really just a set of unusual, unlikely circumstances. He had been added to the coaching staff at the last second, and it was in hopes of forging a relationship with Webber, drawing on his days in Detroit, where Webber was from, as a star for the Pistons, and being an all-around skilled big man and just a really good dude. Now, Donnie Nelson was the first assistant, but he was fired along with his dad. Rod Higgins never really had head coaching aspirations, and Al Attles, the only other assistant, had given up coaching of any kind more than a decade earlier. So kind of fell to Lanier. I'm not even sure Al traveled with the team even at that stage. So the staff kind of gives you an idea also how Nelly was hoping to keep the peace with Webber, I suppose. It wasn't going to be Nelly directly, but he was going to have enough go-betweens to try to make it work. My biggest memory from that stretch for that team is that I'll never forget walking into the coach's office for a pregame interview with Lanier sometime in March. And we asked him about Carlos Rogers, who was a gifted but very high-strung player. And all of a sudden, Lanier started weeping. And I mean, it was so quiet, and he kind of bowed his head. And Matt Steinmetz, who is now a radio host in the Bay Area, it was the only other guy there. It was the two of us, and it was just couldn't believe what we were seeing. I mean, it's March. It's not a very good team. There's nothing. Couldn't figure it out. I was like, what the hell? And so Lanier excuses himself, and Matt and I are sitting there for a second, just kind of looking at each other, eyebrows raised, wondering what's going to happen next. Lanier returns. He's dabbing at his eyes with a paper towel. And then he went into explaining how he had been trying so hard to reach Carlos and some of the other young players, and he just couldn't connect with them, couldn't motivate them. And I've seen Lanier in Basketball Without Borders. He's an infectious guy. He can take a room full of strangers and get them hyped. And so in hindsight, I understand why it affected him so deeply, but that was weird. Now, two lasting memories of Carlos. First was we were in Miami's Coconut Grove, and there was a guy on the street making those intergalactic landscape paintings with a variety of spray cans and bowls or cutouts. It's the kind of thing you see routinely at fairs and carnivals. And Rogers was fascinated. He thought this was extraordinary art and bought like a half dozen of them. By the way, this is the same trip in Miami. The team gets off the bus. I'm at the team hotel, basically waiting for them to roll in, and there's a woman, older woman, very well endowed, who sees Lanier come off the bus, and her eyes just light up and kind of follows the team and everyone into the hotel. And I remember seeing Lanier the next morning, and I said something like, man, she had you in her crosshairs. And Lanier looks at me, he gets this kind of sheepish grin, and he goes, and they were real too, and starts laughing. So, again, I wouldn't say most, but a great deal of what I learned covering the Warriors in those years when they were playing really bad basketball was just the hijinks and how crazy the NBA life can really be. And I think there's something about teams that are bad that they have their guard down, or maybe that's a function of it. They're just sloppy. And so as a result, you learn a lot about what's going on behind the scenes. Maybe more so you do when teams are buttoned up and they're going for it. I would certainly say that was the case. The Warriors in the heyday the last few years, it's been much harder to have a sense of exactly what's going on behind the scenes compared to those days. The other Rogers story was in Portland, and it was the last game of the year, and he seemed particularly out of sorts. Again, very weird situation, a little bit like Lanier, weeping in his office. It's the last game of the year. They're playing out the string. They're just getting throttled, and he gets teed up and kicked out of the game. And it just seemed strange. They'd lost in double OT the night before in Denver, so kind of understandable that now they were getting blown out by the Blazers. But I was told later that it was because Carlos had received a call at halftime alerting him that an angry relative was breaking the windows in his house back in the Bay. And those were the kind of weird stories that were constantly happening with the team, seemingly from most of the six seasons that I covered them as a beat writer. Then again, they were different times. I mean, this was a time when you could walk into the locker room and you'd find Hardaway pouring a couple of cans of beer in one of those tall plastic tumblers you can get at 7-Eleven to soothe his aching knees. And as beat writers, we knew that if Tim wasn't very talkative the first time we approached him, all we had to do is let him get about halfway into that tumbler, go check in with some other people around the locker room, and then circle back, and we'd get all we wanted and more. The next iteration of the Warriors came while they were renovating the arena, which meant that they played their games down in the Shark Tank in San Jose and were practicing wherever they could, sometimes out at St. Mary's College. And I remember at least one weekend practice where they had turned the heat off because no one from the school was scheduled to be in the gym. So janitors weren't expecting that a professional basketball team was going to show up. You could see your breath. I also remember I remember walking in, and I was a lowly beat writer, wasn't making a whole lot of money, but I had bought a used Fendi. I'd seen a Fendi, I don't know, in a watch store or at Nordstrom someplace, and I just liked it. And it wasn't new, so I could afford it. And I remember walking in, and Ala Abdel Nabi saw it, went, Fendi. That was also one of my lessons, that players are cognizant of whether beat writers have any fashion sense or not. And the whole ink-stained wretch and not dressing, I mean, you see guys now, it's gone a little too far. I see guys who are wearing suits who, I don't know that they're doing TV gigs that night, but it just seems a little overkill. I'm going to wear a suit if I have to be on TV. I'm going to wear a suit if I have to, and if I have to wear a suit, I'm going to wear a nice suit, a nice tie, whatever it is. But if I don't have to, feels like putting on airs to be wearing a suit. That's just me. I'm not taking that as criticism to anybody who's dressing to the nines for games to write. But I don't know. I'll leave it at that. Anyway, this is also, that team at that time was the first time I witnessed great players playing in the backcourt together and openly snubbing each other, which was what was going on between Tim Hardaway and Latrell Sprewell. I also learned that not every draft is created equal. Now, the tough part of the beef between Hardaway and Spree for a beat writer is that they almost forced you to pick sides. Spree was admittedly a wild child whose refusal to suck up to the media or even traffic in the expected cliches gave him the image of this guy spawned by the devil. I mean, he had a really bad reputation at that time. Respected as a player, but the dark side was probably the side that the media was most dialed into. There was the time that he got into a fight with Byron Houston. There was a later incident where he got into it with Jerome Kersey, and couldn't get better of Romeo the way he did Byron, and so supposedly went and found a 2x4 somewhere in the Oakland arena and headed back to the court carrying that. Teammates intervened, and so it didn't get worse. But there was also one of his pit bulls attacking his daughter, and she was badly hurt. And when Spree was asked about it, he showed very little emotion talking about it. In fact, I think there was one point somebody was asking him about it, and he kind of had this. It's not a smile, but I guess it was. Kind of smiled at the question, and I think it was a question about having the dog put down, and so all of that came off really badly. Honestly, gave him the appearance to those. I mean, looking around at the scrum, I remember there was people who had a look in their eye like, this is just a cold-blooded monster. But I'd gotten to know Spree a little bit through some of the other guys on the team, and I knew a little bit about his background, and I understood that in Spree's mind, it wasn't the dog's fault. He was just being a dog. Did he care about his daughter, and was he distraught about her being attacked? Of course he was. But he wasn't going to shed tears in front of the media or even let anyone with a pen or camera or microphone know that he was distraught. It wasn't how Spree ticked. To him, a public display like that would have looked weak. And from what I know about how he grew up, never showing any weakness was considered a key to survival. Now, Hardaway was the exact opposite, at least with the media. He'd act tough at times, but ultimately he'd give us exactly what we wanted, beers or no beers. And I mean exactly. When he blew out his knee in 93, the late George Shirk of the San Francisco Chronicle, who I will always remember in the midst of a game, turning to me and asking, "How do you spell Thermopylae?" It was some analogy that he wanted to use. That was George. But George was also the one that, as Hardaway crutched his way out of the locker room that day to a car waiting to take him to the hospital, George said, "Up until now, Tim, did you think you were bulletproof?" And Hardaway dutifully said, as if he had come up with the line all his own, "Up until now, I thought I was bulletproof." And Shirk, after scribbling that note or that quote into his notebook, looked at me and winked. And the next day, it was the first quote in every story in every paper. But for all the misery of the previous season, the Warriors were rewarded with the number 1 pick. And they ended up taking Joe Smith out of Maryland. And that was, I remember distinctly, there was 4 guys that were in the mix. Joe Smith, Jerry Stackhouse, Antonio McDyess, and Rasheed Wallace. Now, the truth is, I'm not sure any one of those guys would have had a profound effect on the Warriors' fortunes the following season. But it was made worse by the fact that Joe was a follower and he chose to follow Spree, who could party like a rock star and still play like one. Not everybody can. Joe was one of those who could not, and it showed. Now, I don't know if it was Sheed. I don't know how much better that would have gone. Stack would have been duplication for talent that they had. Antonio McDyess, in looking back, probably would have been the smartest play for who they drafted. But they weren't sold on just how smart Antonio was. Had questions about his basketball IQ. Athletically, he was twice what Joe was. And again, looking at these guys through the prism of what their careers ended up being, you could say any one of those 3 would have been better than Joe. But, and I say this all the time when it comes to drafts, who you're drafted by, the system that you're in, the stability of the franchise, the talent around you, all of that has a huge impact on ultimately what you become. And you could say the same for Sheed. I don't know that Sheed was all that when he was in Washington. And ultimately, though, we saw what he could be. Pound for pound, ability-wise, he should have been one of the greatest power forwards of all time. Just talent. I could go into all the things that he can do. Pound for pound, a more talented player than Tim Duncan. But Tim's focus, again, the program, being in San Antonio, being with Pop, all that was a game changer. But nobody gave Tim a better run for his money than Rasheed Wallace. Kevin Garnett, nah. That was the big battle. That was the matchup that everybody talked about. Sheed was a much tougher cover for Tim and did a much better job of defending Tim. So, for what it's worth, for you young guns, want to know a little bit of a history lesson. Back to the Warriors. So, Joe's following Spree, and it's not working. Now, Rick Adelman was the coach, and he did quite honestly, one of the most remarkable jobs ever getting that team to 36-46. Doesn't sound like much, but for what he was working with, pretty impressive. They were in the playoff hunt down to the final weeks of the season, and this was in the days when that kind of record had you in the hunt for a playoff spot in the West. Now, they weren't picking quite as high the following year, but they screwed up just as badly. In an attempt to improve the culture that the Spree-Hardaway tiff had created, GM Dave Twardzik drafted a big center from North Carolina State named Todd Fuller. Devout Christian, crew cut, but far from a lottery talent. They took him 11th. For the record, you look it up, Kobe went 13th, Peja Stojakovic went 14th, Steve Nash 15th, Jermaine O'Neal 17th, and Zydrunas Ilgauskas 20th. Any and all of them were profoundly better than Todd. And so you want to know how you go 12 seasons between playoff appearances? You draft Joe Smith and Todd Fuller instead of Rasheed Wallace and Jermaine O'Neal. Now, when P.J. Caresimo arrived to replace Adelman, I was already sort of on my way out and aware that the Warriors weren't going to get out of their hole because they were once again doing things backward. They hired P.J. as the coach first and then had him hire the GM he wanted, Gary St. Jean. The biggest incident of that season, of course, came 14 games in when Spree put his hands around PJ's neck. And the world came down on Spree hard. Sports Illustrated's illustrious writer, Frank DeFord, I remember this, wrote a 10-page piece in the aftermath about what an extraordinary human being PJ was. And it was accompanied by a 2-page piece, I don't remember who wrote it, on what a scoundrel Spree was. And to be honest, I lost a little respect for both DeFord, who was an early role model of mine, and SI, who selected me for a summer internship that inspired me to pursue a career in sports writing in the first place. They didn't. You looked at DeFord and looked at SI as writer and publication that gets it right, and I felt like they got this very wrong because there was just so much that wasn't taken into consideration for why it happened. First, Spree really liked Adelman, who was as much a player's coach as PJ was not. Second, in the previous 6 or 7 months, they had traded away every single player that Spree felt remotely close to or had any respect for. Billy Owens, Chris Mullin, and B.J. Armstrong were the last ones out the door. The incident also occurred with the team sitting on a record of 1-13 to start the season. So you get rid of all the guys that he likes, that he's played with, that he respects, and you start 1-13. Frustrated and angry about being left holding the bag doesn't begin to describe what Spree was feeling at that point. And if PJ had just been the coach and St. Jean were a true GM, i.e. the architect of this mess, maybe Spree wouldn't have gone after PJ. But he rightfully saw him as the perpetrator of everything. And so the last thing he wanted to hear was PJ telling him to put a little mustard on his passes, as if the reason for the Warriors' 1-13 start was a lack of crisp passing or attention to detail. Spree had 45 points in the season opener on 57% shooting, and it didn't matter. Warriors lost by 16 to the Minnesota Timberwolves. My takeaway from it all, as I was about to embark on a career as a national writer, don't let distance or reputations throw up a smokescreen on what is really going on. All right. That does it for this episode of Bucher Friendless. And you know what this means. There will be a fourth and final, hopefully, my stories from the Warriors' old home. Still to be covered. Got a chance to play in the All-Star Celebrity Game, although for some reason Wikipedia does not acknowledge that All-Star Game started in 2000. We'll cover the return of both Mullen and Nelly. An olive branch extended to me from Nelly, sort of. And the new and jarring perspective I got seeing the Warriors up closer than ever, actually, as their sideline reporter for 2 years. In the next podcast, Ryan Hollins and I will chew over LeBron's AAU antics, along with a conversation about if it's time for the NBA to let go of Team USA and let it return to the auspices of the amateur ranks, now that we're having all of these defections once again. Don't forget to rate the show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want us to do something for you, screenshot the review and send it to @BucherFriends. Also, please do me a favor. I'm thinking of giving away a never-worn pair of Kobe Air Force One mids, size 12. They're black and purple with the sparkly gold laces. They're the shoes that he wore during the 2002-03 season. Now, I'm thinking a sneakerhead or Kobe fan might like them just to have, if not wear. But let us know. If that doesn't cut it as a prize, we'll roll something better out. So hit us at Bucher Friends and let us know. In the meantime, as always, thanks for listening.